resources. And water is particularly important in Houston for a variety of reasons, not only because the water quality is pretty low, but we have an abundance of it and it runs everywhere. Before we get started, I just want to tell you generally how this goes is it's a conversation. Such is going to talk through a few different things. You can feel free to chime in and ask questions and direct the conversation. We're looking to get good project ideas. That's really what we're shooting for. Basically, we stop at a, oh, hey Meredith, how are you? We have food. Good to see you. So actually, before we get started, if you want to get some food, why don't we get eating? It's okay, and we'll get started in about 5 minutes. That's all right. I don't want everybody to have to. It's all right. How's it going?
Oh, let's do it right in the back.
Oh, should we do it in the back there? All right.
Hey, Meredith.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
What happened?
All right. I think we can maybe half. Yeah.
Come on. You can do it. Okay. That's fine. Start the broadcast and then it's break time.
Yeah, sorry. We didn't have to start the broadcast right now. Did everybody get a chance to get some food? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna page Such. We're gonna get this show on the road. Thank you all for coming. Very much appreciated. We're gonna try and brainstorm some project ideas in the last 15 minutes. We ended about 7:57 sharp. Hey Rachel, how are you? Because the center closes at 8. So we make the most of our time together here. What I'd like to do before I bring Such up is just go around the room and we'll say our name, we'll say whether or not this is our first time coming to Sketch City, and one other fact about us. Which random fact should we pick, Neeraj?
Let's go with the song that you last listened to in your car.
Oh, I like that. Okay, the song that you last listened to in your car. It's your name, whether or not this is your first time here, and the song you last listened to in your car. Such, you want to get this started?
I'll go first, yeah. So my name is Such. The song that I listened to last in the car, Round and Round by New Order.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a good one. And is this your first Sketch City meetup?
It is. Yeah.
Awesome. Meredith?
I'm Meredith. Help organize events, and I don't remember what I listened to musically in the car. I'm a nerd, and so I listen to public radio. Does that count?
That counts.
Okay.
We'll jump back here. We'll come to David last.
Aaron Brown. What were the things you were supposed to say?
Whether or not it's your first Sketch City meetup and what you last listened to in your car.
Right. It's not my first, and I'm also a nerd, so it's either, I guess the last one is politics. So.
Is there stuff happening in politics these days? Are there things happening in the news? I don't know. I haven't really been reading.
Very calm period.
Okay. Judith?
I've been here before, and I started this thing where I listened to Mexican radio, one of the Spanish stations, and I thought by listening to the Spanish songs, it would help me be more fluent in Spanish. And I've been doing this for, I want to say 6 months, and I'm still a work in progress. That song I listened to, I don't know what the name of it was, but it was talking about or singing about La Cumbia.
Hey guys, this is the first time in Sketch City for me. My name is Shiv Kadir, and I'm Shiv to make it easier. The last song I read, I think it was, I usually listen to 106.9 classic, like, so I think it was Led Zeppelin, one of them. So
Right on.
My name is Alan, and this is my second Sketch City meeting. And last song in the car was, I don't remember, but it was probably Daft Punk.
Can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, can't go wrong.
Dave?
My name is Daniel. I've been out here, this is probably my 3rd meetup, and last thing in the car. I'm also a nerd, so I think it's been NPR all day.
What's going on with your news?
I'm Ryan. This is my first Sketch City, and song, right?
Yes.
Okay. ELO's Telephone Line.
That's a good song.
Nice.
That's a quality song.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Everything
Everything ELO ever did was quality. So.
I've been addicted to it.
This makes me like think of all these songs I want to listen to. Dan Aspen, this is my first Sketch City meetup, and I'm gonna be honest, I've been going through this Lord of the Rings soundtrack phase for
That's
the
awesome.
past few days.
Nice.
Hey, I'm Andrew. This is my first meeting. Last song I listened to, whoever song it was, but Bonobos album.
Yes. Thanks.
I'm Elizabeth Spike. It's my 3rd or 4th meeting, I think. And
Last song you listened to in your car. NPR seems to be popular in the jukebox.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. Maybe it was something on KPFT. Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, I'm Amin. This is my first time, and last I don't listen to music. I listen to podcasts, Radio Lab, NPR.
Cool.
I am Autumn. This is my first Sketch City meetup, and the last thing I listened to was NPR. I also really like 88.72, classical and 88.73, just like their adult alternative station.
Rachel?
My name is Rachel. I've lost count how many Sketch City meetups I've been to at this point. The last thing I remember listening to was Fake Love by Drake. I'm a very big Drake fan.
Which one? Drake?
Fake Love.
Oh.
I'm a very big Drake fan. So it was nice.
My name is Jennifer. I've been coming to Sketch City since sometime in the spring. And so you don't get the wrong idea, I am a nerd who listens to NPR, but the last thing that I listened to was like
What now?
the 8 Mile Summer.
Oh, nice. serious bunch of people. Awesome.
My name's Ian. This is my first meetup, except for a R web scraping lab. That was a few months ago. I went to that, but otherwise, this is my first meetup. The last thing I listened to was Lawrence new album.
Nice.
Probably live only.
Awesome.
So I'm Tyler. This is definitely not my first Sketch City meetup. And my last song in the car was Heads Sprung by LL Cool J. So,
My name is Frank. I've been to each of these. And, my last song I listened to in my car was Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now by Starship.
The Jefferson Starship?
Yeah.
How fantastic. Isn't that the theme song to Mannequin? Is that the theme song to Mannequin? Is it? Yeah, all right, thank you. Mannequin is the second best film ever filmed in Philadelphia. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kelly Circling. I'm new to Sketch City and was drawn in by the environmental water theme tonight.
Nice.
Yeah, I listen to podcasts when I commute on the bus, so probably.
What's your favorite podcast of the last month or so?
I mean, I'm listening to a lot of the Pod Save America, but sometimes The Bachelorette.
And so we're saying our names, whether or not this is our first time at a Sketch City meetup, and the last song we listened to in our car.
We're ready. I'm Jessie. I'm new to Sketch City. I'm a hydrologist by training, and I did my research on the San Jacinto waste beds. I looked at over 170 years of environmental data. So that's what brings me tonight. It's an interesting topic area. And I think data management is really cool, really important to activate change. I don't listen. I have lousy taste in music. I'm an avid reader. And I'm reading the Southwest Airlines Way, Building Relationships and Trust right now. It's a great book. No, not
San Jacinto waste pit. So are you telling me that putting junk and concrete into a giant wall around toxic waste isn't the best way to deal with it?
That's a loaded statement. I would love.
We can get into it.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I like it. All right.
My name is Bobby Bassett. This is my first meeting here at Sketch City. Last thing I listened to was a podcast, The Minimalists. You guys heard of them? And Ritual, which is another podcast I listened to. He was the guest on that. So.
Cool. Awesome. I think we're jumping around to the back row here.
My name is Sarah. This is also my first meetup. Also drawn in by the water theme of the night. And Jessie, is that right? I was very interested in topic recreation. We will talk about this later. And I'm going to have to jump on the NPR train. That's definitely what I was listening to on the way here. The last song I listened to, I don't know if this is embarrassing or not, but it was Dust Bowl Dance by Clifford and Sons.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Rachel Gossett. This is also my first meetup. And what I last listened to, I'm currently in this project where I'm trying to reread the whole Harry Potter series by September 1st, which is when the epilogue takes place. So I've been listening to the audiobooks for that.
The epilogue takes place on September,
This September 1st.
Wow.
Like,
That's really cool.
My name's Emma. This is my first Sketch City. I'm a hydrogeologist, so the water theme is all for me here. And the last song I listened to in my car was Bar by
Cool. Yours?
I'm Eric. This is not my first meetup either. I last listened to Philosophize This, which is a philosophy podcast. But the last song I listened to was actually Rock the Bell by And tonight,
Sketch City loves Cool J.
my favorite thing after Sketch City Icons is if you have XM Radio, there's Toka Tuesdays, which is like a mix of hip hop stuff. It's really good. So that's what I look forward to tonight.
Nice. David?
I'm David Wilson. This is not my first Sketch City meetup. And I didn't listen to anything in the car on the way here, but once I got here, I listened to one of the singles off the upcoming album, new album by Nothing More. The name of the song is Let 'Em Burn.
Nice. All right. Good work, music. Well, without further ado, Such, why don't you come up here and we'll get this started and this conversation going. Welcome, everyone.
If it's any consolation, I listened to NPR before I listened to the song I listened to. So, well, thanks for having me. I've known Jeff for a very long time, and I think what you guys are doing in Sketch City is phenomenal. So, thanks a lot. Sorry. So, I'm a hydrogeologist as well. So, it's a lot of fun doing this. And just by way of background, so my name is Such. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey's Gulf Coast program. And we have a brand new team that is the Innovation Research Team. So what that means is we're trying to bring in civic tech, gov tech, and just technological advancements to how we communicate our science in general. And I think it's really important, primarily because it is water data, first of all. But second, is because we have a mandate to have open data out there. That doesn't mean that we do it very well. And so what we're trying to do here is to look at the landscape of water, particularly in the Gulf Coast, but in general. And that could include water quality, that could include water availability, and to a certain extent, it includes water policy / water management. And by the way, interrupt me, I want this to be a discussion, I want to talk at you. But I know this is a water quality hack night, but I think that it would be really helpful to just kind of go over the water landscape of the Houston, Galveston, Fort Bend region in general, and see how we got to this point. So, since the 1900s, we can just go as far as back as that, groundwater was the primary resource of the region, right? So, oddly enough, we're in a city where we get a lot of rain, we have a bunch of bayous everywhere and right next to an ocean, yet groundwater is what drives everything in this town. And since the 1900s, we've been pumping so much groundwater that ultimately we had to switch over to surface water in the 1960s, right? So groundwater drives our water policy here. And as a result of all this groundwater withdrawals, our land is subsiding, right? And the reason I wanted to start off with that is because it is not at all mutually exclusive to the water quality issues we have here. So when it comes to the subsidence, our land is sinking. The scientific word we would say is compacting, and I'll get to that in a second. But as a result, it could exacerbate flooding. It could cause a wider water quality issue. But in general, groundwater is the issue. Surface water is our quote-unquote solution. That's essentially how the region looks at it. From my standpoint, just really quickly, the U.S. Geological Survey is embedded in the Department of Interior. We are essentially one of two agencies that essentially is the research arm of scientific programs, right? So there's 7 missionaries in the survey. One of them just happens to be water, and it's the largest one. We go from earthquakes, volcanoes, endangered species on up to the water aspect of it. And we work mainly with NGOs and local municipalities and state governments, as well as international. So that's kind of our spectrum that we're working on here. For me, in our innovation and research team, so I basically had, there's 3 big programs for me. There's groundwater, there's the coastal, so I'm looking at like natural hazards, I'm looking at storm surge, and I'm looking at our drinking water, primarily Lake Houston. And that's where the water quality conversation comes in. So in those 3 particular aspects, the nice thing about our particular region is nothing is mutually exclusive to one another. That's what's really cool. So even if I'm working with the city of Houston on Lake Houston stuff, or I'm working with the National Weather Service on the coast, or I'm working with NOAA on various extreme weather issues, all of these people are absolutely related. So that's something that we are unique to than the rest of the country. And a lot of that just has to do with our geographic location. So, that's kind of where I'm coming from. From a water quality standpoint, I can start there. The biggest thing that we all know is where our drinking water comes from is Lake Houston. The U.S. Geological Survey gets real-time water quality data from what we call inflows, but they're really just rivers coming on into Lake Houston, and then have real-time data in Lake Houston itself, and then downstream of Lake Houston. And the reason that that's even happening is because Lake Houston, our drinking water source, is really the decision-making principle for the city, meaning depending upon what the water quality is in the lake, they make their water treatment decision. And so we're essentially their kind of barrier to before they make their decision on how they're going to treat that water. They have to treat it when it's what we call baseline conditions, there's no rain, so they have a general good idea of what they're going to be treating. But based on how much it rains, how high the rivers get, how much is going into the lake, their decisions have to be really, really fast. And that's where we come in, and that's why it has to be real time. And when I say real time, we give them data every 7 minutes. And every 7 minutes, they can see what's changing, how much is changing, depending upon, and then there's various algorithms based on what kind of weather's coming in, et cetera. But what may not be known, and I don't think us scientists do a very good job of trying to explain it, the major thing isn't probably what you're looking at in terms of water quality. It's really sediment. We're looking at how much turbidity is what it's called, how much gunk just gets into the river, and that gunk being sand or silt or gravel. That's what they're looking at. And that's their primary concern when they have to treat that water. So every time that they're looking at real time, and if it's basically, it's kind of cool if you go into their little control room, there's like 4 huge TVs, and they're looking at how things are changing over time. The big one in the middle is what they call turbidity, which is sediment, right? That's what they're looking at. Is it going to clog up their treatment plant? Is it going to cause other water quality issues, such as naturally occurring salt that gets embedded into the sediment, things like that. But the main thing, that's what they're looking at. So for us, our goal is to A, make sure that there's real-time data available, and B, make sure that we're collecting things that's necessary for the 4th largest city, right? Lots of questions come to them being City of Houston. Is this drinkable? Do I need a different kind of filter than the ones that you guys recommend? Or do I need to make sure or test my own water before I drink it? And they get a slew of questions. What's interesting is 2 things. One is that we are collecting data based on a procedure, whether that procedure be quality assured and quality controlled by what's going on in the rest of the country, or whether that's at the very minimum what large cities like this have to do. And the reason that's important to say is because if the City of Houston is collecting data, or the survey is collecting data, or consultants are collecting data, or whomever, and it's great, we need all the data we can get. The question is, and Jeff and I talk about this all the time, is are these data being collected the same way? Is the data being managed the same way? Are they doing quality control the same way? And that's really what I come to when it comes to my team, is like, when we put this data together, make sure that we're collecting data consistently, and the data that you're inputting is consistent, so that you're not comparing apples to oranges. And to me, that was the first thing I wanted to talk about when I got into this new realm, really. So being a hydrogeologist and then getting into the tech level is definitely 2 different people talking 2 different languages. But it's been a lot of fun, in that the government definitely does not have, hasn't put this being water data as its top priority in terms of getting that data out. And that was our goal. So let's get this data out, communicate it well, and communicate it in a way that it's consumable to everyone. So that's my goal, anyways. But do y'all have any questions before? Yes.
I have 3 questions.
Yes.
One, do you all participate in, for example, round robins, where you send other labs around the country or samples?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the U.S. Geological Survey has 16 labs, and all of them have various things that they do. So the biggest one is in Denver and Washington, D.C. And your question about round robin is that the smaller labs that are non-governmental labs or whatever, they're actually are embedded within the U.S. Geological Survey's water quality laboratory style. You know, whether that's what kind of schedule they do in terms of how they analyze the data, isotopes, all the way to things that I don't know how to pronounce. But yes. So your question is, the round robin is basically U.S. Geological Survey style to new private labs that are coming up, for example. So that's what's quite nice, is that if they're using our style, our schedules, the way the laboratories are maintained, all the way to how the data is analyzed, then it's pretty nice in that sense.
What about analytics? Do you all use the same analytics?
We don't. We don't. And that's a big inconsistency for sure. The analytics and the management of that information is very unclear, very inconsistent, and can be detrimental to a decision. So, yeah.
And then my last question has to do with, are solids really the worst thing? There's ways to separate solids from the water, and it's things that are soluble, infinitely soluble, that really are more dangerous.
That's true. Are you, by any chance, a water quality person? No. Just a hydrologist looking at San Jacinto waste pits. Okay. I would agree that, yeah, there's other worse things, but I'm definitely not the person to ask whether are the solids the worst or not. I'm not.
Well, no, I had a question.
Yeah.
What's the difference between elevation and subsidence? Or is that?
Yeah. Do you want to go there?
Yeah. I was curious about that.
I can do that. But I'd love to get back with you on that, because I really don't know what the answer would be versus why solids really the worst thing versus other things. I don't know. The EPA would say, yeah, solids are the worst thing, but that is their MO, I guess. Yeah. Okay, well.
It depends upon your place.
Right.
Something that's super toxic in an area that doesn't necessarily have exposure routes or receptors. Ultimately, the toxicity of that compound is tied to that exposure route pathway.
Are you guys just doing water quality testing pre-treatment when it's in Lake Houston, or post-treatment?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say pre-treatment, solids are you're gonna be worried more about that,
Yeah.
because that's going to impact the treatment process. Whereas post-treatment, that's where you really want to start worrying more about heavy metals that can be
Exactly.
in the water and stuff
Right.
like that.
So that's exactly right. So A through Z, where the sediments and water is coming from upstream, right, all the way into Lake Houston, and then post-treatment down to Z being our faucets, right. And just one more thing is that the part that needs to be done that I don't think that we have a good handle on is the infrastructure, right? Once it gets into the infrastructure to our homes, what's that component that we have to deal with? Yeah.
So I have a comment and I have a question.
Yes.
And when I sponsored Texas Stream Team training in my classroom, I learned that 90% of the surface water in Texas is labeled impaired, mostly due to bacteria.
Right.
And the EPA, in terms of water quality, will check for bacteria, turbidity, solid oxygen, conductivity.
Some nutrients.
And something else
Yeah.
that's stable right now. But my question is, you were going to talk about compaction, and so maybe at the same time you want to tell us why the land subsided,
Yep.
and where did it subside the most?
Yep. Yeah, that's I'll go there as well. Jeff, do you want to?
No,
okay.
thank you.
Yeah, let's. So we're lucky is that tomorrow is the release of the world's first land subsidence interactive web application, which I'm really excited about. So it's a good question because here the U.S. Geological Survey has an unprecedented amount of data, 42 years worth of subsidence data. It's the largest in the country, and we're lucky to be able to have 4 decades of data. So let me start from the very beginning. So as groundwater is withdrawn, right, it started from agriculture in Fort Bend area and Brazoria area. Then we went to an industrial phase, right? Baytown, Clear Lake, that whole area where the big refineries are. And the third was this huge population growth. So those three factors have contributed to what's called subsidence, and I'll get to what that is here in a second. What happens is when you withdraw water from the ground, and the type of geology that we have here is mainly silt and clay. That's not as important as knowing that the way that the water is taken out when we withdraw water from here, what happens is all that pressure that's in the ground is released. And once that pressure is released, the land subsides. Land elevation subsides. So earlier, Jeff, when you said what's the difference between elevation and subsidence, elevation is land surface elevation is literally changing. And what's subsiding or compacting is the geology in the ground. You can squeeze it. So that's exactly what's happening. Elevation is decreasing. The subsidence is what is happening beneath the earth. So that's sort of the definition that's said there. So in terms of subsidence, as we are withdrawing this water, pressure is being released, and water is no longer in the ground, and the ground elevation is changing, subsidence is occurring. The problem with that is that infrastructure now begins to fail. Railroads, our sewer pipelines, things like the best case as actually the intersection of I-10 and Beltway 8. That is the largest area of subsidence in Houston. A lot of the reason it is because there's just a whole bunch of clay in that area, and that clay just released the pressure immediately. So Jersey Village area, that Beltway at I-10, over the course of 42 years, it subsided 12 feet, which is quite a lot. Yeah.
Is that 12 feet like exclusively the result of withdrawing water from the ground, or is it also just an impact of like weight of all the concrete, or like what's the percentage of like responsibility?
Right. Great question. So first I can just answer no, it's not the weight of the concrete. And the reason we know that is because we have these instrumentation, and I'll show you some of these app releases that we have, is there's this instrumentation, there's 13 of them across the region. They're called extensometers. These data extensometers, what they measure is how much the clay is compacted beneath the ground. So the reason we know that concrete isn't a factor is because it's so far beneath the ground that any kind of weight on land surface would have absolutely no impact 200, 300 feet below the ground. Yeah, so something happening at 300 feet is impacting our land surface elevation change. Yeah. So there's 13 of them across the region. And they're pretty phenomenal. They go down about 4,000 feet beneath the Earth's surface. And there's 3 aquifers here in the region. The first 2 is what was used from about 1900 to about 1950. And then, as so much subsidence started occurring, we went to a third one, even further deep. And that's now the focus of the region. The city of Houston is now looking at, well, should we be using that third aquifer, or should we just stick with the surface water? Right? The conversation got even a little bit more heated in 2011, which is the worst drought on record in Texas. Once that drought happened, and they realized that, you know what, we don't have a robust drought contingency plan, what are we going to do? That's when this whole conversation of, well, what percentage of surface water or rivers are we going to use, of Lake Houston are we going to use, what percent of groundwater are we going to use? Then they said, you know what, we might have to tap into another resource, which is, let's purchase some water from Lake Conroe. So they have Houston's other contingency, is they own a percentage of the water in Lake Conroe. So it's interesting. It's an interesting situation that they have to keep going further, or we as a city have to keep going, further outskirts of Harris County just to get more water. And so that's what's happening. The last, no, go ahead.
How do we use so much for a reservoir?
Yeah, I was just getting there. So the last piece of the groundwater management puzzle, right, is the Trinity River, right? The Trinity watershed. So we all live in the San Jacinto watershed. Adjacent to us is the Trinity. The largest interbasin transfer in the world is about to take place here, meaning that they're going to take Trinity water and bring it into Lake Houston. And that is just mind-boggling to me, because you're literally taking an entire ecosystem, changing it up, and pulling it on into Lake Houston, which is in the San Jacinto watershed. The Lynchburg Reservoir that you mentioned is in the Trinity watershed. Let me first why? Why in the world are we doing this? Well, the simple answer is we just don't have enough water and population is growing. The more complicated answer is that our watershed, the San Jacinto watershed, is a lot smaller than the Trinity is. So when it does rain or when we don't have water, either way, it's detrimental. So the watershed is so small that when there is intense rains, we are going to have flooding. It's whether we have subsidence issues or not. Flooding is going to occur when we have such intense rains. If we had a bigger watershed like the Trinity, it might flood, but just not as intensely and not as frequently. So that's complicated reason number one. Number two is that as Trinity water comes into Lake Houston, it's been measured that the water quality in the Trinity is exemplary enough that when it comes into Lake Houston, there won't be too much of a need to do treatment mixing or things like that. And that's sort of the two conversations. Yeah.
I just want to preface my question that I like science and technology, but I know almost nothing about the engineering of water and treatment and stuff. So this might be a silly question, but you're pulling sources of water from lakes and rivers and stuff. Is desalination not an option? Or is that just, is it like too expensive or I don't know.
No, that is a good question. So it's a great question because it comes up all the time. Why aren't we using desalination? Well, for one, desalination, you're right, is very expensive. And it's probably best if we use it in situations where there's a lot of salinity taking place. That isn't the case in where we live, particularly in the San Jacinto watershed and the Trinity that's coming in. So there, it probably isn't the best case. Perhaps in other cases, down in the Gulf Coast towards Corpus might be an option, but not here. Yeah.
I saw online, like Hitachi or somebody has like a huge desalination plant. They put it in for Dubai, I think, for water, and they said it was more cost effective actually than getting water. So do we have like systems that are desalination plants that are much more cheaper than compared to drilling, getting water from Trinity to here, right?
It's a good question. I would imagine that there's got to be some efficient use for desalination. So interesting tidbit is El Paso has the largest desalination plant in the world. They are largest inland desalination plant in the world. And that's because they have naturally occurring salt in their water. And so the question for them was, well, should they get water from the Colorado River Basin in New Mexico and bring it in over? Or should they have a desalination plant? Well, they decided on the plant. And one of the factors was that they wanted to own their water. That was their thing. And that argument happened here in terms of, well, who owns the water, right? That's the next question. Who owns the water in the San Jacinto? Well, who runs it is the San Jacinto River Authority. On the Trinity side is the Trinity River Authority. So that makes things a little bit more complicated in terms of who owns it, how much do they distribute, how do they even quantify that, what is good water quality when it moves from point A to point B. So there's a lot of things going on in our region that's really exciting in terms of the data that's being collected, how that data is being managed, and what that data is going to look like when it's all put together. The exciting thing for all of us is that there's 19 or 20 entities and organizations involved in this. So, they're going to have a huge responsibility in terms of consistent data collection and consistent data management and dissemination. So, it's a big deal for us to keep them accountable on this.
How is water moved from source to source like that?
They are building a canal. Canal's being
I'm sorry.
buckets, yeah. A canal is being built. It's called the Luce Bayou Canal, from the Trinity on into Lake Houston area. So.
What's the geography? Do they need locks, or is it?
I don't think they need locks, but I think they are going to have some kind of a system, like a horsepower system that there's more energy on the Trinity side versus the San Jacinto side or something like that.
So, if I'm hearing you right, in order to hedge their bets on having enough fresh drinking water for the population of government, they purchase water from a different jurisdiction and have it sent here. Is that right?
Yes.
Am I hearing you right?
So the jurisdiction point is correct, right? So, for example, the city of Houston purchased water from the city of Conroe.
Right.
So that's one thing, right?
So what is that? Does anybody look at like the zero sum of water that exists, perhaps, and how much is being sold off, what that's worth, and the kind of water rights that might be inherent to Conroe residents to maybe, not run out of water themselves?
Right. So the valuation of water.
Yeah.
So
Is that information public?
that I don't know.
Okay.
But your question about how do they know how much is being used versus, is Conroe going to need that water that Houston's taking, that kind of thing? Yeah.
Or is it valued appropriately based on, Conroe's the only closest game in town? If transport costs are an issue, maybe I guess the economics
Right.
of how water gets purchased from jurisdiction to jurisdiction is really interesting.
So that is available. So that's available from the Texas Water Development Board.
Okay.
So the Development Board has either consultants, so the Geologic Survey has done some, and others, they do these water availability studies and their models. So these models go out to 30, 40, 50, 60 years into the future and says, all right, so how much water is going to be available if there's X amount of population and they're drinking this much, that kind of thing. So those are available online. The model files are there. The data that was input into the model are there in the Texas Water Development Board website. So let's go to your Conroe question real quick, Jeff. So the city of Houston, purchased 25% of Lake Conroe water. How in the world do you figure out that 25% of that water you're being used and how much is left? It's arbitrary, it really is. But the mere fact that they were able to do that is because Conroe was set up to have groundwater available for them to drink. So they had already decided, hey, if Lake Conroe was not suitable for the population that we currently have, well, we're set up for groundwater. So all of these subsidence issues we're having here is going to happen in Montgomery County if they don't manage it well. Right? So they should take lessons learned from us for sure.
But how do you know how much water is available on those aquifers? We know that when they take it out, when it gets dry, the water doesn't come out, then we know that it's dry. But how do you know? Is there a way to quantify this much data about water is there in the aquifer?
Yeah, so we do that using mathematical models and statistical models. So, the more data, the better, in terms of well data and how much is there and that kind of thing. But statistically, we can look at various scenarios that are happening currently or happening in the future. So we look at various statistics on, what's the thickness of the aquifer? How deep are these wells? How often have these wells been used? What's the water use over time in various areas? What's the population? So there's all these various variables that go into this model. And statistically, we do figure out what's called a GAM model, groundwater availability model.
Do you have well data?
We do, yes.
So you can monitor the pressure in the wells that are around.
So so there's in some wells there's real-time monitoring, right? So we can understand the fluctuation of water within a well. In some cases, there's areas where there's nested wells, meaning that these wells are at different depths, and you can and see how each well is interacting based on the other well, that kind of thing. So, yeah. You got a question?
Is there a way to use groundwater as your drinking water source without having subsidence occur, or is there learning techniques that they use? I mean, you talk about Houston having the third aquifer as an option. Like, why would that even be an option if they've already had all these problems?
Right. If they've had problems in the first two, why in the world would that third one be an option? That is a great question. When they started tapping into that third, deeper aquifer, and when I say deep, I'd say about 4,200 feet deep. So, and it's in different thicknesses based on where you are. So, the further north you go, the thinner it gets. Here, it's pretty thick. So, your question about, well, how can you withdraw water without subsidence occurring is a difficult one, because where there's silt and clay, the way we have them in Houston, there's really no way around it. Now, there's been studies that say, well, if you decrease the rate in which you withdraw water, that might be suitable. But the question is that the amount of water you want? Is it, are you maximizing efficiency by doing that? Yeah, there's all these other questions. Yeah.
So, my previous job before I started doing this kind of stuff, I was working with one company out in New Orleans. And a lot of these problems sound pretty similar. Like one of the ways so pressure here, reservoir increases, you make less oil, you make less money.
Right.
So one of the ways we kept pressure up there was to actually inject seawater pressure up in the reservoir. So that's the first thing I think when it comes to this. Now, the first issue you see there is like compatibility between your drinking water and your non-drinking water that you're injecting.
Right.
But if you're treating on the surface anyway, it seems like you may be able to mitigate that. Is there any reinjection you have going on, or does the clay compact such that there's no velocity?
Right, that's a great question. So there are two studies that I know of, the other hydrologists chime in, but there's two studies that I know of in this area going on called aquifer reinjection studies, right, where you can reinject water that's not being used and save it for later, basically. And they're looking at these studies to see if that's even a viable option. And the type of geology that we have, it may not be a viable option. They're doing that in Central Texas, however. There's quite a bit of aquifer reinjection projects going on. So. Exactly. Right. That's right. That's right. So yeah, that's a good point. Central Texas is what's called karst geology. It's all caves. And it makes sense that you're able to do that aquifer reinjection, right? There's no clay, no significant clay, and no sand for sure. So it works there. Here, I have my doubts that it would work without a lot of engineering and construction. So, yeah.
For reinjection, do we need to use fresh water? And if so, where do we get it from? Talking about reinjecting into our drinking water sources.
Right.
Are we collecting rainwater or municipal wastewater?
So there's a couple of different ways. In Central Texas, for example, they are looking at treating water that's been used and then re-injecting that in.
So treating municipal wastewater.
Yeah, the gray water is kind of what they're looking at, right? So that's one project that I know of in Central Texas. And then they're doing something in the El Paso area where they're taking that naturally occurring salt water that's there, you treat that, and you re-inject that in. And that'll be like your resource, for a rainy day kind of thing.
I'm curious about the position that you've taken on to VOSGS. What do you need to take your work to the next level? And where are you thinking about taking this data management system
Yeah.
for VOSGS?
So I have a grand team of 8 people. And I started about a year and a half ago. It's a new position. And we finally have gotten headway on changing how the Department of Interior is looking at disseminating this information. So for example, this 40 years of land subsidence data is a really good example. It was, what happens is, and this is science in general, right? What happens is we write these really nice journal articles and reports and all this scientific jargon's in there, and it sits on somebody's bookshelf, right? What does that do for us, right? What does that do for a policymaker? What does that do for people who want to use this information to do something better? Absolutely nothing. So the goal for me to come in here was to say, okay, what are we going to do with all this information that we currently have, and put it out there so people can use. And then the next step, B, is to look at the data that we are currently collecting, and it's all real time. So how do we put this real time data out there that people can use, download in a fast, efficient way? And the USGS has been doing that in terms of the real time data. The question is, how accessible is it, right? Can you consume it well? Can you get that data, even if it is every 15 minutes? Are you getting it every 15 minutes? That kind of thing. So that the goal here was to first take what's going on, what's the most impactful thing that we can do first. And so we took this land subsidence data and we created an application for it, where people can interactively look at what's happening in the wells and seeing how things are changing. And then at the same time, see how subsidence has occurred as a result of the water use, right? So that's two things. So what the U.S. Geological Survey has done every year for the past 42 years is collect these water levels in a 5-month period in 700 wells. So these 700 wells, it's at 700 now. So when they started 40 years ago, it was probably 180, 200 wells. And the network has increased. And like I said, it's, we're really lucky to have this data set. And until now, the survey was drawing these things on maps. You put all these maps together and you look at, okay, I'm from Northwest Harris County. This might be what's going on in my area. And you literally would have to put this scientific story together by paper, by hand, on paper. And that's just not acceptable for something that is so important to our region, that has so much of an impact on our lives, right? It could be, it could exacerbate flooding, for example. Well, why can't we look at this information and figure that out, right? These are the kinds of questions that we have to be able to answer, and I think that the USGS has a responsibility to get this information out in that manner. So that was the goal of the position in the first place, is what is this going to look like? How do we get this information out? What's the priority? So there's 3 of us. So I'm in the Gulf Coast. There's one in Northern California, and there's somebody in Florida. And so those were chosen for the natural hazards that occur in these places. So the earthquakes that happen in California, that's what their duty was. And here, it's all these natural hazards that take place here. And in Florida, it's kind of taking place for the tropical storms and things like that they have there. So these are the 3 areas that they've chosen to get this information out. I look at it from and I'll show you a couple of that we've finally gotten out from a how does it affect people standpoint, and not just we're scientists, we want to get this information out standpoint. It's 2 different ways of looking at it. So, yep.
So besides that app that you have built, are y'all creating consumer APIs where people can connect to it themselves?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, yeah, I can actually bring it up. Yeah. So, we're getting there, baby steps. But yeah, there's a JavaScript API that's being built and that's currently out there. And this is for how to create time series plots and other plots using our water data. And if you get water data from elsewhere, you can incorporate that in and create these time series plots in real time as well. So we're building our API library. It's not as big as we want it so far, but we're getting there. So that was one of the priorities. We wanted an API library. We wanted an open data portal. We want that portal to have agnostic formats where you can use it in any kind of software, that kind of thing. Yeah. So, and we can go deeper into that. Yeah.
Aside from the groundwater data, subsidence data, what else did you put on the data portal and all that? Like, what are the data sets you're going to talk about?
Yeah, so there's two. That's a good question. So floods and the flood data incorporates something called discharge, which means how fast the water is moving through a river at any given time, right? And then something called stage, which is how high the river is at the time. So in real time, we built this application or this tool so that you can find your stream gauge wherever you are. So if we were to use this application, you can look at the 3 closest stream gauges to where you are. And you can look at how high or low the river is at any given time, right? So if it's raining outside, for example, and you want to see, well, hey, should I be driving on the road at this particular time or should I wait? You can use this application to do that. Now, the thing about it is, it sounds really simple, and we should have done this a long time ago, but this is all real-time information. All it's doing really is grabbing data from our existing database that we have that's updated every 15 minutes. Yeah.
This is just rivers, it's not bayous.
Bayous, yeah.
So it includes the bayous.
Yes.
Just to clarify, you say you have an app that will tell me if I should or should not drive, or you have an app that will let me consume the, what do you call it?
The stage, how high or low the river is, yeah.
And then I have to interpret from that whether or not I should.
That's a great question. So here's what we tried to do, right? We give you a red, yellow, green, right? So, this red, yellow, green will say, hey, if you're in the red, you can drive if you want, but let me just tell you that the river is higher than it should be, right? That kind of thing. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you guys do water quality testing, like looking at turbidity and stuff for drinking water.
Yeah.
Do you post that on your data portals as well?
Yes.
Do you know what parameters you guys all have in there?
Yes. So each and every real-time data is turbidity, specific conductance, dissolved oxygen, various nutrients, and specific, there's one more. But that's at everyone. And then at some of them, based on its geographic location, we collect even more data. So we collect sediment particles and how fast they're going and that kind of thing.
Do you guys do any microbial or pathogenic material testing?
We do testing on harmful algal blooms, so that's one. And then we do testing on other indicators for taste and odor for them. Yeah.
Does it give you any kind of prediction, what is going to happen or something like that?
No, this is not. That would require a model, like a mathematical model. No, that's not. So the real-time stuff that's out there is just simply that. It's the data happening at real time, right?
How many data collection points do you guys have?
In general, in the Gulf Coast area, maybe? Yeah. Wow. So in real time, I would say for bayous and rivers and how high or low or how fast they're moving, I would say there's about 450 real-time sites. For groundwater sites, real-time sites, there are 120. And that
How's
goes.
that data transmitted back?
So, okay, so there we have it hooked up to Department of Defense satellites. So they go through Department of Defense satellites down to our receiver and our servers and all that, and then it gets updated there. Based on where you are, so we have this priority list of what we feel are important real-time sites, and maybe some that, if it's not updated every 15 minutes, maybe it's updated every 17 minutes, that goes to a different satellite. But we have that priority list based on, historical understanding of what's been highly hazardous versus what's not. That kind of thing.
Do you know how much data gets transmitted? Like the
Oh,
order
wow.
of data size?
Yeah, so somebody asked me this the other day. I have it written down somewhere. I'll have to give it to you. It's something crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
You said it's every 7 minutes or 7 days.
So every 15 minutes. Yeah.
That's the sample rate, or
That's
just
how
the
much. That's
transmission in batch?
so every 15 minutes the data is updated. Right.
What's the sample rate?
The sample rate, the baud rate.
For your sample, for how often your sample flow and turbidity and all of
Does
that?
it average over 15 minutes?
Gotcha. Yeah, it does average over 15 minutes, right? So during, like I was saying, at different real-time sites based on its hazard indicator that we have it, some actually are real-time every 5 minutes. So then over 5 minute time, it's an average.
I have been working on a flood gauge project, and I applied to get access to the data, and I was rejected. So
that's not good.
that was maybe a year ago. So I'm wondering, maybe with the move towards more open data.
So that data is open. Are you talking about the?
Yeah, I'm trying to find here exactly. I didn't remember that it was with the USGS.
Well, then that's a great example of it not being accessible enough. Yeah, that's for sure.
Okay, so for the Senior Center, the shelter workers go back to 1875. How are you taking those tones and getting them into headlines?
So are you talking about, so there's two things there. Are you talking about like the hydrologic data over time on a gauge?
Yes.
Okay.
So like at Lake Houston, we have the daily maximum and minimum, and then you have the stage information.
Right.
Or like, yeah, there's absolute max, absolute minimum, and then recently the average flows. But historically, how do you take a PDF document with those numbers that may have been scanned and turn it into
Digital data.
Yeah.
Oh wow. So we leveraged a program. Yeah, this is good. We leveraged a program in the Washington D.C. area. The Office of Library and Information Communication. They have a program that anybody can use. NGOs, private industry, you name it. And they actually came down and scanned these documents, digitized them, put it in a system. It took them, I think, this was even before I got there. It's like 6 years, I think it took them. Yeah. I asked that very same question. It's like, how in the world did this happen? So, Office of Library and Information Systems or Communication Systems. I'll look it up. It was free for us. Yeah. Might be another story for you.
Harris County Flood Control.
Oh, that's Flood Control District. Yeah. Yeah. That's an issue maybe. Yeah. But we have all of those same sites. They're using our sites online, so you can get that same data. Yeah. Yeah.
You had mentioned that you're trying to better disseminate your data out to the public.
Yep.
What efforts, aside from just making it more visually appealing through what you've been talking about, what other efforts are you making
To disseminating that and make it accessible? Yeah.
and just so people know that it's there?
Right. That last part, let me start with that first, because that's the toughest thing, right? Hardly anybody even knows that the U.S. Geological Survey exists and that we even do water, and it's not just some earthquake organization, and why are we even in Houston, right? It happens all the time. And that's the first problem, is that nobody knows the existence of A, the entity itself, and B, that the information exists, right? And this information, there's so much of it. So that last part is actually getting the U.S. Geological Survey into the current era. Like, how, everything from social media is over here, right? Getting out there and talking through what this information means is the most important thing, right? Communicating complex information, complex hydrologic information is not a strength of any of the scientific agencies. So the first thing to do is, and the first thing I saw, just by observing for the first 6 months, is to figure out, why aren't people, getting the information they need? Why are the only people that are using the information are the people paying us to collect it? Like, that's not okay. So the first thing we simply had to do is be out here, right? Be out here and say, look, this is what we do. This is the information we collect. And we're collecting this information because it's, for either for natural hazards or because land is subsiding, and this information has to be garnered to the people and the residents of Brownwood neighborhood, or et cetera. The third thing that we've been doing is partnering with the National Weather Service and NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Service, who also have a similar hill to climb. The best one out of all of them is the National Weather Service. They do a fantastic job with putting their data out there and letting people know what they do, right? We all know what they do. We see it on the news every day. Weather Underground, all their stuff is just out there in a nicely wrapped, and we know exactly what they do. We may not know how they get their information or what their computer models look like or whatever, but we know they exist and we know what they're there for. So partnering with either NGOs or other agencies is a crucial step in getting our information out there. These applications and all of that, that's great and everything, but really they don't go to, we have to go to that next step, which is telling someone, hey, don't get in your car. It's not a good idea to go driving, right? That's the next step. Getting people to have that information in their hands was the first one. So.
Have you considered partnering with sort of more successful areas of the USGS and getting data out? Topograms, aerial photography, anybody who's ever worked in GIS knows USGS is a primary source of information.
Right. Yeah. So we partner with the National Mapping Program, who now has all their maps on, accessible and available to everyone, which is fantastic. So we're partnering with them, and really the most successful open data program or the information dissemination program is earthquakes. They're the best ones out there. Their real-time sites along Mount St. Helens or along the various fault lines in California, they're accessible and available to you now. And they're real time every minute. So.
And also along that line, like university libraries, places that house data sets as.
Yes. Yes. So we just started a new program with the University of Houston, actually, in their geology program. They have a couple of professors who are working on subsidence as well. So we're not duplicating effort. We're sort of partnering with them in terms of the data they've collected, data that we've collected, and how to house that for academia as well as the general public. So yeah, it's a good question.
Is the data that you guys are making available here, is it all data that USGS has collected, or have you consolidated data from all of those disparate groups that you
Only data that USGS has collected.
And are there any plans to build needs for some of those other agencies or organizations?
For me, not right now. I want to get the USGS data out. Because what that would take to incorporate other people's data is that whole data inconsistency problem. Because if we're looking at all of this data on one application or one full swoop, I would want to know how that data was collected. Is the quality control the same, etc. Otherwise, it wouldn't be beneficial. So right now, it's the USGS data. Yeah.
On the flood control side, it talks about what instrument was used, and on some of the gauges, they'll say, well, we switched over to a new instrument on such and such a date, and it's really well documented.
Yeah, they did a great job. Yeah, it's great. We have Harris County Flood Control uses all of our gauges, and then on the gauges that they piggyback off of, they also have their own rain gauges in real time. So it's great. We have real-time rain information as well as the stage and discharge of those rivers. Yeah, they're great. So.
Awesome. I have a question for you.
Yes.
What can we do as citizens, as people who can do stuff with data? What are some of the things that we should start exploring? What are some of the things that we can start building?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. I feel that there's not enough remote sensing information that goes along with this information that we've been collecting, right? We have the access to remote sensing, but remote sensing data on its own is easy and accessible to download, right? Remote sensing information as a tool to see how well the information we're collecting hasn't been done. I think that's important. I think it's really important to do. The second is, and as you can tell, one of my biggest things is to keep the government accountable. Like, what are we doing? Are we doing it right? Are we providing you the information that's necessary? And in order to do that, that's why we have to build these teams of people who can put this information together and out there. That's one. The other, Jeff, and you and I have talked about this, is how do we look at things on a micro level? I'm looking at things at a macro level, on a regional level. Let's look at things on a neighborhood level. How do we do that? That's the question. I think it's more important to look at things on a zip code level, for example, than for me to look at, I'm providing this data for 40 years on a regional level, and that's great because that story needed to be told. But now it's so many people, and there's so many issues as a result of people moving in, water being withdrawn. Now the question has changed from, well, okay, how much water do we have over this large region, to what is happening in my neighborhood? What is happening in my zip code? And that data is available, but is not managed in a way that we can use. That's what I think the next step should be, is micro water management.
Interesting.
How is that data available?
So the data, all of the water data is available and out there. It's just not separated into zip codes, for example, or the questions aren't even being asked as to, well, what's happening in my micro watershed. And HGAC, the Harris-Galveston Area Council, they ask these questions. They're actually very good at saying, what's happening in your watershed in 77024 or whatever. But I think that citizens getting involved to answer those questions is the best way to answer that question.
You should have a meetup.
I should have a meetup group. Yeah, why not? Yeah.
So on
Jeff will help me. So.
The Galveston Bay Foundation has a Galveston Bay report card that releases
It's awesome.
basically the state of Galveston Bay, but in that they have a house line watershed option that divides all of the different parameters you're looking at into individual watersheds. So, and it's very user friendly.
It's pretty great, yeah. And their report card, if you've never seen it, HARC was one of their partners. They did a great job of essentially telling us what the health of these bays are, of Galveston Bay is, ABC, and what makes up those indicators and how they got to that conclusion. It's great. And they partnered with the Houston Endowment to do that. And I think the next step, actually, Jeff, the next step is to do that very same thing, the health of our bayous. And we're getting there. The Houston Parks Board putting together these connecting these bayous together and these walkways together is the first step, and that's great. The second step is, well, what are the healths of these bayous now as a result of them being connected, of people actually using these trails, the city itself becoming more in tune with what's going on outside. I think it's great. I think that's the next step, because the data's there, right? It'd be a different story if we had to go out and keep collecting this data, but the data's already there. So we can look at, well, what happened before the bayous were connected versus what's happening after.
I'm curious, can I look right now and find water quality data for Buffalo Bayou? Is that on the USGS site?
It is, but it's not very easy to get to. Yeah. And yeah.
Like, what do those sensors look like? Are they very visible? Like, if you were to paddle along Buffalo Bayou, did you actually see, how are you actually physically measuring those
Okay, so there's two ways. So there's no real-time water quality monitors on Buffalo Bayou, for example, right? So there's two ways that the U.S. Geological Survey is collecting water quality in various parts of Buffalo Bayou. One is after an intense rain event. Let's say it rained from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. And at a certain point, people get pinged and they actually go out there during that time and collect bacteria samples. So that's one, right? So those are event-driven water quality parameters. Second is under conditions of what's happening when there's no event going on and just basically people being out there, is it a health hazard, right, of various bacteria counts. So, what would be ideal is to have real-time water quality out there. We just don't have that. And here's the reason, is that it has to be of importance to our municipal government to do that. That's the bottom line. Our municipal government has to find that to be important.
I'm curious where along Buffalo Bayou do you pick to sample?
So I would choose 4 or 5 different areas. There's one in particular that we do always. Those always points are where the city of Houston has mini water treatment systems, right? So during a flood event, where these water treatment systems are, and if they are discharging water during an event that is under the levels, we want to go sample there. Right there where it's entering Buffalo Bayou, we want to sample there. What exactly is the bacteria looking like once that's discharged? So there's 7 of those treatment plants, I believe. The other places where I would want to go collect, if I had the money to do that, would be above Addix-Barker Dam and below Addix-Barker Dam. That whole avenue right there, that little segment of Buffalo Bayou, is probably where so much of the water quality is changing as a result of the dams themselves, behind the dam and past that dam. So that's one segment. The other segment that would be really good for Houston to have is near the ship channel. So.
Next, when you say another source of publicly available, it's not real time, but publicly available water quality data for Buffalo Bayou and some of the other Houston bayous, you mentioned the Houston Galveston Area Council. They have a Clean Rivers program where they post all their water quality data around the entire region as well.
Sure.
You talked about the remote sensing data, get something
On the remote sensing data? Yeah. So LiDAR data, does anybody know what LiDAR data is? So LiDAR is really interesting. It's light detection and range. So it's a new, excuse me, it's not new. It's a really high resolution data set, digital elevation model data set. And it was flown in 2002, I believe, right after Tropical Storm Allison occurred. And so that was the impetus of flying this instrumentation and getting this information. And the reason it was important is because the resolution is 1 foot resolution, right? And you can really get a good idea of the elevations of your rivers, the elevations of your land. You can get a really good idea of where the areas are sinking, etc., right? So remote sensing data like that is a really good way of understanding a couple different things. If we being the survey, if we have subsidence information, well, how accurate is that information using this remote sensing? Like, that's important to know. Or how much elevation has changed as a result of subsidence, for example. That was really good information to know. A second thing that came out of that is where our fault lines were. We never had a really good comprehension of where the fault lines are in Houston, and there are faults. They're prominent. And so that really helped us get an idea of, well, and from a groundwater standpoint, where these fault lines were. Well, was groundwater acting differently? Or was subsidence acting differently? Did it subside more where there's a big fault line, et cetera? A new LiDAR is going to be flown in 2019. The last one was flown in 2009, so we have those 3, 2002, 09, and now we'll have 19. So we'll have a really good idea of how our area has changed. So that's one type of remote sensing that I think is extremely important. And then there's several others that are flown but very locally, right? And then there's all this other remote sensing data that I think are important in terms of looking at how streams have changed over time. And that's where Harris County Flow Control does an amazing job. They look at, you know, the geomorphology, as it's called, of the rivers changing and why that's important and how that changes our landscape and what that has to do with infrastructure. Does infrastructure break as a result? There's a slew of implications that happen as a result of those changing rivers. Now that land use has changed so much to impervious cover, that changes the ball game altogether, right? The ball game has changed from we used to have a lot of green space, or at least not as much impervious cover, to having a ton of it, right? And that changes how much bacteria goes into the water, for example, or that changes how much discharge or how fast the river is moving, right? Because there's more water going in and less of it going into the earth. So all of these information is used by the city of Houston, for example, for various analyses and things like that. But the question is, how can we use them to better that analysis, right? And provide them feedback.
So I saw a really cool app that's in development by Open Austin right now called E. coliiform, and it's a Twitter bot that tells you the current E. coli readings of various swimming holes around Austin.
Nice.
And so it just kind of gives you,
nice.
lets you know whether or not you're going to get sick. And I thought that was a really, I mean, that's a good example of stuff that's applicable to our groups, where you don't have to know a whole lot about water data, which is incredibly complicated, and clearly there are scientists in the room who've dedicated their careers to understanding it. We don't have to go that far, but if we are able to identify a use case that can provide a public good from this data, and you can help us find these needles in the haystacks, then building the applications becomes a whole lot easier. So I just wanted to thank the scientists in the room here for coming out here, and hopefully we can kind of figure out amongst all of this data, like where are the really relevant pieces that we can start to build on.
For sure. I think that one of the biggest things that we need to start putting out there is bacteria data. HGAC has a good data set of bacteria data. The City of Houston has bacteria data, but I want to see something that tells me, what the bacteria counts were on this day when it rained this much, because I want to know if that's going to happen again in the future. We just don't have something as robust as that. And it's fairly simple from the standpoint of that data's out there, but where is it? And let's put it together and let people see, what the history of, bacteria is in Buffalo Bayou during a particular point in time. That's something I think is really important. The USGS data, we just don't have a lot of bacteria data, regionally. Buffalo Bayou, Brays, and Halls, I think, are the three biggest ones. I think we need to get that on. So that's the kind of stuff you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Let's just get, just a slew of data and just let's look at things simply. During that air quality, did you already have the air quality hack night?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Okay. I was going to say, those are real-time stations, those air stations, right? So the question is, what can we do, like a Twitter bot, with the real-time stations that are available now?
Yeah. And real-time meaning as long as TCQ decides to share that data.
Right.
In real time.
Right.
I think Jen had her hand up.
Yeah. You had mentioned something about the red, yellow, green type of warning.
Yeah.
Does it provide you information of when a given location has hit flood stage where it is over top?
Yes.
So it can go that specific.
It can go that specific,
so
yeah.
You could
so if it says
sign up to get a notification, maybe.
Yes, you can do that. Yep. So there's a threshold. If it goes over that threshold, it's on the flood stage. Easy. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think you handled them all.
Talked up. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. We can spend the last 15 minutes kind of logging some project ideas into GitHub. Meredith, was there anything that you wanted to go over? I know you got here a little late.
Yeah. We definitely do want to find out the topics that you're most interested in so that we can dedicate enough time to them to really be able to brainstorm project ideas and discuss those as a community. So if you have any ideas on that, what feels like the right amount of time to let these things kind of percolate, please let us know, because that's ultimately our goal, to foster that kind of thing. If you don't have the link to the GitHub repo, we can pull that up for you potentially. And also, for those of you who are new, we do have a Slack team where we discuss project ideas during the week. So that's a great place to continue these conversations and try to find other people who are interested in the same things if you don't already connect with them on GitHub. So we would love to send the link out to GitHub and throughout the week add ideas there if we don't get them entered tonight. So I will probably be sending out a survey tomorrow as well, just to learn a little bit more about what you're looking for from us and how we can equip you to succeed on the projects you want to do.
Well, that's it. Feel free to, if there's any pizza left, grab it, and we're gonna vacate the space in about 15 minutes. And until then, just make yourselves at home. And such, I want to talk to you about bacteria. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.